Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests and friends of the Allied Museum, I would like to welcome you all here at the Allied Museum Berlin, a place of remembrance and learning dedicated to the Cold War period, in which the divided city Berlin was one of the focal points of a global conflict. We are in the Outpost Theater tonight, a theater which got its name by the US troops stationed here in West Berlin. Outpost because the troops understood themselves as the outpost of freedom in the middle of communist territory. Of course, we as museum people believe that lessons can be learned from history and that the Cold War period tells us a lot of how we may deal with conflicts of today. Therefore, we want to reinvent the museum at a much better place in the center of Berlin, the former Tempelhof Airport, an airport which the famous candy bomber Gail Halvorsen once called the Statue of Liberty of Berlin. The story we want to tell deserves a much better place, a place of historic importance where we can reach a much broader and younger audience. To be honest, we never thought that Europe's security order established after the fall of the wall or the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1990, which led to peace and economic welfare on both sides, would be attacked by Russia one day. We are facing a brutal war in Europe, which also has the potential to escalate in a nuclear conflict. Unthinkable before, bitter reality today. When US President Joe Biden said that the current nuclear threats from Putin remember him of the Cuba crisis of 1961, we as the Cold War Museum were on high alert. It seemed only logical to react on this current situation and invite 3 members of our museum association, the representatives of the former Western powers, and discuss the options of diplomacy in times of war and crisis. I'm very, very grateful that the Excellencies Jill Gallard, the Ambassador of the United Kingdom, Dr. Amy Gutmann, the Ambassador of the United States of America, and François Delattre, the Ambassador of the French Republic, have accepted our invitation. A cordial welcome to you all. I also would like to welcome Mrs. Nora Müller, who will be our moderator tonight. She is the head of the Berlin office of the Körber Foundation and the director for international politics at Körber. She is a member of the ISS, the Institute of Strategic Studies, has served for the Auswärtige Amt, the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and worked with the Goethe Institute. Therefore, her career and daily work is deeply rooted in the topics and issues we would like to discuss tonight. We cannot think about a better moderator for tonight's panel. Thanks a lot for coming. Before I hand over to Nora Müller, I would like to thank everybody who made this evening possible. It's quite a challenge. My staff, the technicians around here, the translators backstage, the photographer, and other contributors. A special thanks goes to Uta Birkemeyer, who was the project manager for this evening tonight. Thanks a lot. Let's start. Our honorable guest, Mrs. Müller, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
I think now it's on. Once again, a very warm welcome to all of you, those of you being here on this historic site and also those who watch us online via YouTube. Diplomacy in times of crises and wars. What a vast but also extremely timely topic. Dr. Delattre said it already, war in its most brutal form has returned to Europe on February 24th. Europe's post-Cold War order was actually destroyed, and today we find ourselves in a world of uncertainty, a world in which agreed upon rules no longer apply, and a world in which different systems, different countries compete for power and for influence. Winston Churchill once said, it's better to jaw than to war. And what he actually meant was that it's better to talk to each other rather than to shoot at one another. That is something we would all be able to subscribe to. But the question is, do we always have to talk? Do we always have to negotiate at all costs? That's a question that is very topical these days. And what does it take for modern day diplomacy to be effective? And what are lessons that we can learn from conflicts, from confrontations in history? I think there is really no better place than this place, the historic site of the Allied Museum, a museum which is inspired by freedom, and a museum that shows that enemies can turn into friends. And I'm also very honored and delighted to have here a fantastic panel with me. By way of a brief introduction, I will say that the British ambassador, Jill Gallard, next to me, has been in her position since November 2020. She's just come from London, I think, for the Königs Winter Talks, which is interesting. Maybe we'll talk a bit about it later. And she joined the British Foreign Service, I checked this, in 1990. Year, which was a time of hope. The Berlin Wall had just come down. It was the end of the Cold War. The end of history was kind of near. So that was a very special moment in history. And the one red thread in her diplomatic career is Europe. You served in a number of European countries, both East and West. You're multilingual, and we're very fortunate to have you here in Berlin. Welcome. With us also is Amy Gutmann. She's the U.S. ambassador to Germany, has been here since February 17th this year, so she came just a week before the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine started. She's a professor cum diplomat, and for her, Berlin, I would say, is not just any diplomatic posting. Her father, Kurt Gutmann, he came from Feuchtwangen in the south of Germany, and he had to flee Nazi Germany. And it's very moving, and in a way, coming full circle, that 88 years later, Amy is here, a U.S. diplomat to Germany, to a free and democratic and peaceful Germany. Great to have you with us here.
Thank you.
François Delattre is also with us. He is the French ambassador to Germany. He started his posting in September 2020. Before that, he served as Secretary General of the French MFA, and he also had a stint as French permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. And he started his career as a diplomat at the French embassy in Bonn, I think, at the time, in 1989, also a historic year, and I'm tempted to say all the rest is history in a way. And I'm also happy to say that the French and the British ambassadors are still on speaking terms, even after Saturday's football match. So it's good to have all of you with us. Housekeeping. Just a quick remark. We will have a conversation here on stage before we'll open it up to your questions, your comments. We'll make sure that there will be enough time for you to chime in as well. So let's get this started, Jill. This is about diplomacy in times of crises. When you look back at your own diplomatic career, what would you say was the one formative moment for you, which you still remember, which kind of constituted your personality as a diplomat?
So I think actually it was before I became a diplomat, and it's because I grew up in Northern Ireland, and it was when I went to university in Scotland and told people where I was from, and the reaction was usually, "Oh, poor you, Northern Ireland," because this was in the middle of the Troubles. And it was the first time I really thought about how that had formed me. And I remember thinking, it's crazy that people are killing each other for nationality reasons, for religion reasons, And I think that was when the spark to become a diplomat first landed with me. So my answer to the question is it was before I became a diplomat that I thought I want to try and avoid conflicts like this, and I want to try and resolve them. And diplomats love to talk, and that's why it seemed like a good career choice.
That sounds super interesting. Amy, you're still a young diplomat because in your former life you used to be a professor and a political scientist. But when you think about this one formative moment that made you go into diplomacy, what would you say?
Well, the most formative moment for me also was what you mentioned, which is my father's escaping Nazi Germany in 1934, and that really always was something that inspired me to want to pursue a career of figuring out how do we make democracies last and how do we make them work for their people. And then the formative moment for me was when I got a phone call and the President Biden was on the line. I was actually, yes, I'm a professor, but I was president of the University of Pennsylvania, so I ran a university and 6 hospitals, and we are the largest employer in Philadelphia for almost 20 years. So that takes quite a bit of diplomacy. But when the president was on the line and he literally said to me, "Would you like to be my ambassador to Germany?" that was a pretty formative moment. Never did I imagine the most formative moment of my diplomatic career, which came just a week after I was at the Munich Security Conference. So I was whisked off. I believe the push for confirming me was the Munich Security Conference. Whisked off, did speed diplomacy at the Munich Security Conference, all about Russia's intent to invade Ukraine, and then a week later it happened.
Right, and we'll talk about this in a moment. But François, what was your one formative moment in your diplomatic life?
I would say that in my personal history there are 3 defining moments that made me who I am, at least as a diplomat. The first, as you alluded to, Nora, is when I was a young diplomat in the French embassy in Bonn during in the late 80s and early 90s, and so I had the joy and pleasure of living the reunification with my German friends. And so Germany and the Franco-German friendship since then are truly part of my DNA, would I say. The second moment is my long American journey, where I had the pleasure of meeting Amy, when Amy, ladies and gentlemen, won one of the most successful presidents ever of any American university, in this case the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, where my 2 sons and my wife studied.
He's totally impartial, as am I.
It tells you a lot about Amy's ability to convince. And so I had the pleasure there to meet with 3 consecutive American presidents, George W. Bush, then President Clinton, then President Obama, to whom I presented my credentials. And when President Obama saw me, he said to me in our first conversation, "Ambassador, I was told you are the youngest French ambassador ever to the U.S. To which I had no clue what I should say. And I say, I don't know if I'm the youngest, but I'm by far the happiest ambassador. And then every time we crossed paths, he went to me and said, "Are you still the happiest ambassador in town?" And my motto was to say, "More than ever, Mr. President." So that's the American part. And then the UN part, very important, 5 years. So I went as ambassador to Canada and to Washington, and then as ambassador to the UN, where truly I discovered with Samantha Power and then Nikki Haley, 2 great ambassadors, and also my British colleagues, what multilateralism is all about, what the P3 that we represent is all about as one of the backbones of multilateralism. And so by way of my background, I would say I'm pro-Europe with Germany. I'm pro-transatlantic, so to speak, with America. But I'm also much pro-multilateralism, and I believe everything we can do in terms of war and peace has to do with multilateralism and working together.
That is the perfect lead over. Thank you, François. And by the way, I hope you will all, by the end of this session, be the 3 happiest ambassadors here in town. But Jill, this terrible war of aggression against Ukraine was mentioned a couple of times already. And I wanted us to go back to February 15th, in fact. That is the day when Olaf Scholz, our chancellor, traveled to Moscow to talk to President Putin. And, you know, we all remember this gigantic white table that they sat at. And by that time, the White House and others had already put out intel about an imminent Russian attack against Ukraine. And in hindsight, of course, we know that Putin had already made up his mind to follow through with the attack. Now, what were your thoughts on that February 15th? And would you say that this is an example or a moment which shows what the limits of diplomacy can also be?
So, 15th of February, we too, with our American friends, were trying to persuade other countries that we really thought Putin was going to do this. And the rational part of us was saying, surely he wouldn't. How could that happen? But I think it's fair to say, I've got colleagues in the room with me who were part of that journey. We weren't sleeping very well because we were aware that if this did happen, it would turn the world upside down. And I think the main lesson for me is you do what you can, and if what you hope is not going to happen does happen, you have to quickly regroup and you fall back on your preparations. So we had been talking a lot about what would our response be, how can we act quickly and united to show that this is not acceptable. And it very swiftly moved into the territory of what can we collectively do to make clear that we are unified against this aggressive invasion. So we almost didn't have time to worry about has diplomacy failed, and I would say it hadn't failed because the unity with which many of us imposed sanctions, the fact that at the United Nations over 140 countries swiftly condemned what had happened, that was all diplomacy having prepared the path in a worst-case scenario.
And do you think, I mean, there is a big debate about whether, you know, Western leaders should or shouldn't talk to Putin right now. On which side are you?
So I'm a diplomat. I think dialogue is always important, but there's a difference between dialogue and negotiation. And it's very clear to us that it's for President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people to decide if/when the moment is right to get into discussions themselves with Putin. So dialogue has a purpose, but it's not the only answer.
Let me come to you, François. Your president recently visited the United States, and during that visit, he suggested that the West should take into account Russia's need for security guarantees, should Putin want to return to the negotiating table. So this raised some eyebrows, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Tell us about this Macronian idea, and do you believe that this is the right moment to speculate about this type of diplomacy eventually?
Thank you very much, Nora, for the question that I expected a little bit. I believe that quite often with the press, and no criticism whatsoever, it's not my style, but I think the quotation of President Macron was quoted totally out of context, as we say here, and for real. For us, and I believe for the three of us, we are in a war. We are in a war through which a country has been attacked at the heart of Europe, so the return of war to Europe. The whole values and principles of the UN Charter have been violated, where a country, Russia, is talking about not only defeating another one, Ukraine, but putting into question its very existence as a nation. And fifth, an attack in which the methods that are used by the aggressor tend to be war crimes. I'm sorry, but when you deliberately target civilian populations or civilian infrastructures, this has a name in international law, and this is war crime. So make no mistake about it, we are in a war. And in a war, we know a bit about allies, and we are thankful to America and the UK in our history. And we know that now is a time of war. It's a time of combat. It's a time of giving the Ukrainians the means they need to prevail on the ground. And then, at the second stage, when time has come, and it's not the case as we speak, then it will be time for negotiations. But each step at a time, now we provide maximum armaments we can to Ukraine. I saw a few hours ago that the Kiel Institute said that France was the third largest provider of assistance to Ukraine. And I think it says a lot about the fact that on the humanitarian front, on the forensic front, on the economic and financial front, but also on the military front, where our Caesar, one of the best and most efficient weapons in terms of artillery, is truly helping Ukraine to prevail. And that's what we want. The rest belongs to the future. And when the time will come, then we'll start about negotiating and ending the war. But for the time being, no mistake, war and war and war.
Thanks for that clarification, François. You said these, weapon deliveries are there to help Ukraine prevail. My sense is that, of course, the West does a lot to support the Ukrainians, and rightfully so, but there's a lot of unclarity what the actual war goals should be. I mean, from the German side, we say, Russia must not prevail, but the German chancellor didn't say Ukraine must win. So how do you read that? I mean, what do you think Western or European or whatever war goals should be in that war against Ukraine?
Again, that's a very fair question. I believe that, number one, it's up to the Ukrainians to decide when and at which stage and under which conditions the time of negotiations will start. And again, this is not the case as we speak. So that's number one. Number two, from the outside, but it's easy from the outside, I would say that the two conditions for a durable peace is, number one, a withdrawal of the Russian forces from Ukraine, from the territories that they occupy in Ukraine. And number two, the durable conditions for respect for Ukrainian sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity. When the two conditions are met, I believe we solidly can say peace has a chance. But again, it will be up to Ukraine to decide when and how.
Mm-hmm. And, there are a lot of experts who say that we're in for a long, protracted war of attrition, and we'll see when the time will be ripe for any type of negotiation. Amy, I wanted to present you with a figure from a poll that was conducted in Germany in late August, and I would assume that the figures right now are still similar. And in that poll, 77% of Germans said that the West should initiate peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. So how do you think should one respond to these kind of demands from European publics?
So first of all, I think I just want to thank my colleagues here on both sides for being such great diplomats and having such great diplomatic relations among our countries, and with Germany. Let me answer that by answering the question about diplomacy, and I will answer that, I promise you. Diplomacy is a central tool in our toolbox. And make no mistake about it, if Vladimir Putin were ready to have a diplomatic solution to this horrible, brutal, illegal war that he is conducting, Ukraine would be ready. And we would be ready to support Ukraine. But he could stop this right now. And there is no diplomatic solution to this problem as long as there's somebody conducting a brutal, illegal war of war crimes against a sovereign democratic nation, against any sovereign nation for that matter. But it happens to be that the Ukrainians are fighting for the very same values that we are enjoying at the same time as our hearts are going out to our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. And as François and Jill both said, we're doing everything we can to help Ukraine defend itself. You picked a poll number. I'll cite poll numbers back to you. One poll after another of the German public has asked, will you still support Ukraine, even as inflation and higher energy prices happen over this winter, even through a terribly hard winter? And every poll we've seen, there are a solid majority of Germans who say, we will stand in support of Ukraine. Chancellor Scholz, the leaders of all of our countries, I'll speak, on behalf of President Biden, have said, we will be with Ukraine as long as it takes. That's a diplomatic statement, to say that you will be with a country that is not part of the EU, not part of NATO, but is fighting for its democratic sovereign right to survive. We should make no mistake about it, and I don't think the German public is any doubt that Vladimir Putin's intent is to obliterate Ukraine, its culture and its people. And there aren't that many simple good versus evil events on a world stage. This is one of them, in the sense that it's morally simple. And it's excruciatingly hard to figure out how we're going to help Ukraine end this in a way that Ukraine can survive. And that's why we're doing everything we can to support it. And
you're happy with the level of support that Germany is giving to Ukraine?
I think that what Chancellor Scholz announced February 27th was nothing short of a historic turning point, following a historic turning point in February 24th of nuclear power, without any provocation, invading a sovereign, democratic European country. And so I believe, and I think the evidence supports it, that we're all working together diplomatically and militarily in aid of Ukraine. We are not fighting this war. Ukraine is, and Germany is doing more and more. Germany has often said, going back to when I started at the Munich Security Conference, having bilateral meetings with Chancellor Scholz and with Annalena Baerbock, Minister Baerbock, and they all said, as Jill, I think it's worth underscoring, what they said was, it may take us longer than you wish, but if Putin invades, we will be with you, and we will be as prepared as possible. We all wish we were more prepared, and Germany certainly wishes it were more prepared at that time. But what Germany is doing is something we all ought to support, and just as I encourage and our administration is encouraging our own country to do more and more, we're encouraging every other country, and of course, as U.S. Ambassador to Germany, I spend a good deal of time encouraging Germany to do as much as it possibly can. It will never be enough until it's enough to enable Ukraine to win this war.
Right. We've just come back from Warsaw, and we had a roundtable there over the weekend, and one of the takeaways was the degree of frustration of our Central and Eastern European neighbors with Germany. Is that a sense of frustration that you can understand when it comes to the support, the German support for Ukraine?
So I would say, more than frustration, what we all have to understand is the absolute angst that Ukraine has in the absolute horror that it faces day in and day out when it sees, feels, and reels under the brutal attacks of infrastructure, of hospitals, of schools, of roads, of nuclear plants that Putin is inflicting on us. The one thing that we all here work really hard at, and it's hard, and it is diplomacy, is making it clear to Vladimir Putin that we are more united than ever before. And that is true for Eastern European countries and Western European countries. Yes, there are tensions. Yes, there are frustrations. But make no mistake about it. When push comes to shove, we're standing together. Poles and Germans are training Ukrainians. Poles and Germans and Eastern Europeans and Western Europeans. Yes, it's a division that has a history behind it, and it's a really hard history behind it. But if there's anything that has pushed us to be more united than before, it is the actions of Vladimir Putin. So I wouldn't fret over some of the verbal, expressions of frustration, because when it comes down to it, we are so united in helping Ukraine, and the frustrations are pushes and pulls to do more and what to do, and that's part of diplomacy. Would I wish that it were all done in private rather than in the news? Yes. As we say in America, hell yes. I mean, it would be, because I don't want anybody to mistake that for anything other than, in some sense, it's a race to the top. And François, I loved it, when he cited France on a Kiel report as number 3. I think it's great that we're competing to be the number 1 in supporting Ukraine. And that's what the Eastern Europeans are doing. They're pleading for more.
Thanks for that. Jill, I wanted to sort of throw the ball into your court and have a question about the global Zeitenwende, but I think you also wanted to come in on Germany and its support for you.
Thank you. If you forgive a British ambassador for making a post-Brexit point, I wanted to pick up on what Amy was saying, to say that not only has Putin united the West, but I think it has also given my government an opportunity to show that when we have repeatedly said we've left the EU, but we have not left Europe, here is the proof. We are the biggest European contributor to NATO. We were training Ukrainian troops years ago, and I just wanted to say that because it's another example of whether it's Western Europe or Eastern Europe. It's been really heartening to see how well we all work together and coordinate. So thank you, Mr. Putin.
And can I make a light point? I mean, just to show how historical this is. Our country fought a revolution against England, and who was our ally? France, right? And now we're all allies and we were allies against Germany in World War I and II. So imagine how things can change for the better. All of that, I would submit, humbly,
Yeah, absolutely. Even though
Been
France
changes
beat
for
us at
better.
the World Cup on Saturday
Right?
night, François and I are still talking.
So it helps to have a historical perspective on this.
Certainly does.
And none of this came easily. It all came with a lot of hard work.
That almost sounds like a concluding statement, but we're not there yet still. I wanted us to talk a little bit about another historical analogy, namely that of a new Cold War. And some people say we are in a new Cold War, and others say this is a sort of misguided analogy. Jill, your new latest Prime Minister Sunak said in a recent speech, and I'm quoting, "We recognize China poses a systemic challenge to our values and interests, a challenge that grows more acute as it moves towards even greater authoritarianism." But then he also warned against this sort of Cold War rhetoric, this Cold War analogy. Now, walking this very fine line between competition, even rivalry with China, and at the same time also cooperating with China, because we need China in so many global issues, is in a way the ultimate challenge for a diplomat, right? So how do you walk this very fine line? What does that mean in practice for a diplomat?
So I think it goes back to what we were talking about at the start, that a big part of diplomacy is dialogue. And so what our Prime Minister was saying is we need to engage with China. We're not going to solve climate change, for example, without China at the table. But we need to do this with our eyes wide open. And some of what China has been doing in terms of authoritarian regimes or human rights of the Uyghur, the democratic legacy in Hong Kong, which for us is a particular historical responsibility and we're seeing hugely threatened, and also some of the national infrastructure threats from China. So what our Prime Minister was saying is, it's not that we're saying China equals black equals bad enemy. We want rivalry with China on the trade stage, but we need to be very careful about broadening our supply chains, not being too over-dependent on China. And this isn't China-specific, actually. This is a wider lesson that I think a lot of us have learned, perhaps starting with COVID, where we realized that we were over-dependent collectively on some countries, whether it was for PPE or, in Germany's case, the over-dependence on Russia for energy. I think what we've all collectively learned is we've got to diversify our supply chain, and that's a broader issue than just China.
Right. So, François, the question of where Europe stands in that geopolitical rivalry between the US and China is a very interesting one. So there's this triangle of China being a partner and a competitor and a rival, and it seems to me that, you know, the pendulum is swinging towards the rival side of things. But still, it's an interesting question where the Europeans position themselves. Our Chancellor Olaf Scholz just went to Beijing, and I understand that President Macron is headed for Beijing in January, maybe. So what are the kind of messages you think he should deliver in Beijing?
That's a huge question, but just you
have 2 minutes for it.
Just a couple of things on this. Number one, you said it, China is at the same time for us a competitor, a strategic rival, or a systemic rival, and a partner. So you have 3 baskets, and the fact of the matter is that most of the issues we are dealing with are in the basket of competition or in the basket of systemic rivalry. And the domains in which we can cooperate with China are more or less, and it's not nothing, of course, climate change, to preserve the biodiversity, global health, so it counts. But I mean, it's a limited number of things, while on the main spectrum of our scheme of things, we are, let's say, competitors to some degree, strategic or systemic rivals. So that's number one. Number two, I believe what is very important to see, and I think you said a word about that, Amy, is that we should look at China not only in strategic terms, but also in terms of value chains. 10 years ago, we could make a clear separation between political military affairs and economic issues. Today, it's not the case. When we look seriously at a strategy vis-à-vis China, the real question that you also alluded to is how can we pursue a de-risking strategy in order to avoid a growing dependency on China, and in order to avoid also a decoupling, which would be, I believe, in nobody's interest. And so as we speak, I believe it's very important both to be firm and strong in military terms. And as you know, we as France are a power in the Indo-Pacific, where we have territories, we have military, and we do a lot of exercises with our American, British, Australian, German, Indian, Japanese friends. I think it's very important to show China that we want to be present in this zone, whose importance is growing, of course, in the world. So it's not a Chinese lake. That's a place where we have a say, and we as the West must be very present. And on the other side, it's very important to pursue a de-risking strategy, convincing our companies, for instance, to not to be over-dependent vis-à-vis China, be it in terms of imports of raw stuff, matières premières, or to be too dependent in terms of exports. So this is a collective effort that we have to do in this respect. But again, to come back to what Jill said, I believe diplomacy with wide open eyes, by the way, diplomacy backed up by strong military and strong economics is still the best tool we have in our hand to solve the problems of this world. I think it is true on the geopolitical arena, and beyond the war in Ukraine and the tragedy in Ukraine, I think it's fair to say that the geopolitical risk is only here to grow, unfortunately, in the coming years. That has to do also with the fact that our multilateral system, and to start with the UN, is, I would say, more and more dysfunctional. So that's number one. The geopolitical risk will only grow in the coming years. And at the same time, diplomacy is the best tool also to address what we call the global issues. Climate change, health issues. On these two, we have to constantly reinvent our rules in order. I will give you an example that's better than theory.
Quick one, please.
And a very quick one. Climate change. This is according to me and according to France, one of the existential threats we have to face. If we want to be efficient in combating climate change, we have to bring the diplomats, especially the best of them, but also our private sector, our companies, our industry, our NGO, our foundations in the game. And that's what we try and do with the COP21. I will give you an example. When I was in New York at the French ambassador, I initiated a series of discussions with institutional investors, mostly from the US, UK, Canada, France, Germany, and a couple of others. And together we built a coalition that became the Climate Action 100 Plus, which is to this day the largest coalition of investors against climate change. So not to speak theoretically about things, but to ab initio have the private sector in the game, and so have a firepower, so to speak, that is much bigger to address the global issues that are, with the geopolitical issues, the other existential threats that we have to face together.
Thanks for this very concrete example. So, I mean, diplomacy does work even at times of geopolitical tension. Amy, I would ask you for a quick reply, but the Sino-American rivalry is one of the defining issues for international politics in the 21st century. So there are people who say that we are headed towards even more confrontation, an escalation of tension, potentially also a military confrontation. What is your take on this, and what can diplomats do to kind of alleviate the tension? Because ultimately it's a political decision in which direction things are headed. So what's your take on that?
So in my pre-ambassadorial life, I was a critic of those who declared the end of history. History never came to an end in terms of the tensions in the world, the wars in the world, the extreme poverty, the violations of human rights. So now we're working in unity. I'm talking we now, the US, in unity with our allies to prevent a new Cold War. This is as clear as can be that China got where it is today because of the post-World War II international order, a rule of law order, an order that had not perfect but fairer than ever grounds for trading and investment, increasing respect for human rights. Now China is the only country on the face of the earth with both the intent to destroy that international rule of law order by stealing intellectual property, by gross violations of human rights against the Uyghurs, by basically taking away freedoms that Hong Kong had, by threatening Taiwan and the status quo. So it has the intent and it has the power to do so. We are working with allies, as both Jill and François said, with our eyes wide open, not to decouple from China, because we also work with China on issues of climate change and public health, although its reaction to the pandemic is very troubling. Despite offers of effective vaccines, it decided not to accept. But what we're trying to do is de-risk from natural resources and very advanced technologies and so on. Why? Because we wanted to be clear to President Xi that he can't hold us hostage. He can't blackmail us. If we learn anything from Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it's that we must not let increasingly autocratic powers get the impression, let alone the reality, that they can hold us hostage. And when I say us, I don't mean just the United States. We're trying to do this in concert with more and more allies, and I think it will take time. But I think if we do that, if we have, somebody's analogized it as a small garden with high fences, the garden being those things that we cannot be held hostage or be blackmailed for, then we will not have a Cold War. We might have a cold peace, but we won't have a Cold War.
Thank you very much for this, and that's why we're happy to be here at the Allied Museum.
It's cold.
It's
cold in peaceful times, right?
It's the Allied Museum. It's a museum which was inspired by Western values and by freedom. So before we open this up to your questions, your comments, I wanted to do a very quick round, and I would ask all of you to answer with maybe just one sentence. What do you think the relevance of this great place can be when we come to think about, the renaissance of the West, or what can this place contribute to this debate? Jill, your one-sentence answer to this.
So I think it's about remembering the past, learning from the past, and clocking that reconciliation and allies can come from war.
Thank you. Jamie, your one sentence.
A unique museum, a unique forum that shows how the combination of diplomacy and military, the willingness to use military force only when necessary, but when necessary, combined with diplomacy, is still relevant, and indeed more relevant than ever.
Mm-hmm. François.
Frankly, I could not say it better, and I completely agree. So I would only say a place of remembrance, showing that in times of war, where the essentials are at stake, then the allies should ally. That's the lesson of the museum, I believe. But also the link between that and the future, and the fact that this museum, because it has the depth and breadth of history, is also a platform for the future and a platform for multilateralism and working together. That I would say not as good as you did.
Very, very good.
Thank you very much. And thanks, by the way, for this first part of our conversation. We will now invite our guests to join the discussion. We have time until 8:10 sharp, because then our ambassadors have to leave very quickly. Just as for the rules of the games, please kindly, if you have a question, say who you are, who your question is directed to, and remember that every question should end with a question mark. So
that's a great prompt. I like that.
Who would like to go first? Yes, the gentleman in the first row.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much. I'm Brian Van Swearingen.
We've got a microphone.
Yeah, the mic is coming.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your comments. Am I on? Good. I'm Brian Van Swearingen. Unfortunately, not UPenn graduate, but at National Defense College, so maybe. But in any case, I was interested in the run-up to the invasion of the Ukraine. Certainly President Putin has a responsibility for the orders, there's no doubt about that. But as you look at the run-up to it, and I'm not just talking about the Western, the expansion of NATO, although if you look at the documents, and even former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates made it clear that Gorbachev was led to believe that there would be no expansion. But look at the Kosovo air campaign, where NATO essentially authorized itself to conduct military operations, and also the United States invasion of Iraq. These set dangerous precedents for powers, and not necessarily that justifies anything, but could be a factor in maybe what President Putin's decision came to be in terms of what the solution for the Ukraine. Was there any Western responsibility in the lead up to the response at all? And I'd just be interested in your general thoughts on that, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I was told to repeat the questions for our interpreters, for those who watch us online. So the question was whether there is any type of responsibility for Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And so that question was directed to Ambassador Gutmann, right?
Actually, to all the ambassadors.
Oh, wow. If we have all of them answer all the question all the time, so there won't be a lot of question. Maybe, Amy, if you want
I'm happy.
Go ahead.
Brian, thank you for that question, because it enables all of us, I think I can speak for all of us, and say there's only one person responsible for this war of aggression. There's only one leader of a country, I should say, responsible for this war of aggression, and that's Vladimir Putin. Nothing that any of our countries did prior to this gives any excuse for what Vladimir Putin did. And I should say that the leaders of all of our countries, US, England, France, Germany, were in dialogue with Putin before, putting him on warning because we had indications that this was what he was doing was leading to this. Even before we had those indications, we have been in dialogue and diplomacy, and all throughout we were. Nonetheless, he chose to do what only a brutal dictator could do. And he grossly miscalculated. That is the one really strong ray of hope. You know, they say hope isn't a plan, but he grossly miscalculated because we were planning together. We were planning a response, but we told him at every step not to do this.
Amy, thank you very much for being so clear on that point. And now let's collect some more questions. Well, I do see a number of raised hands over here on the left side. Yeah, maybe the young lady in the middle.
She can go.
Whoever wants to go first.
So this is specifically referring to what the French ambassador said about the dysfunctionality of the UN. Could you please perhaps elaborate further on this? And I know this is a sensitive question to a P5 member state, but also how this relates to outdated power structures in the Security Council, with Russia having a veto right in what some would call the most powerful body in the world.
Thank you very much. Large question. I'll repeat it again for our interpreters. This is a question about, is the UN system still fit for purpose, and does it still reflect the balance of power of the 21st century? François?
That's a very tough question, but thank you for asking. I would personally say that the key factors who've brought stability into the world since World War II are, if not disappearing, at least weakening, let's put it this way. Number one, and under your watch, Amy, I think it's fair to say that the US as such is one of the backbones of international stability, but I think it's also fair to say that the US as the world's policeman is something that cannot last for too long, which brings us also, we Europeans, in a position to share a little bit more of the burden. That's where we want to go, and that's where we're with Europe, but also with, again, the Americans and the British, we want to go. So that's number one. Number two, I think indeed it's fair to say that the multilateral system that we together put in place in the late 40s or in the early 50s are, I would say, aging. The Security Council has proved inefficient on many occasions because of the veto of such and such power. And let's be frank, in the recent years, because of the Russian vetoes, repeated time and again on Syria and now on Ukraine. And I think number three, and that's something many people don't get, but for me as a diplomat, it's, I would say, the most important. One of the things that is lacking in today's international order is the concert of nations. You know, with the lack of an American superpower willing to act on each and every front, which is absolutely fine, with the lack of an efficient multilateral system, at least in the past, you could count on some occasions on a robust concert of nations, the best example of which is the Congress of Vienna, 1815, that ensured European peace for decades, if not almost a century, actually. And today, if you put things a little bit into perspective, you see that the G7, for instance, played a role, but no, it's not the stability mechanism that we need. You saw that the G20 also played a role, but when it's about crisis, war and peace, the G20 is a bit like the UN, and you have conflicts within that prevent the G20 from making any decision. The P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, is a fantastic tool when the 5 do agree, but they don't. And we see that, that Russia doesn't. So my message here is that these 3 stability mechanisms don't work anymore. For this reason, as the economists would say, you have no geopolitical automatic stabilizer anymore. You see what I mean? And we saw it in Libya, we saw it in Syria. Each crisis now threatens to just spread and become kind of systemic, and we have to urgently reinvent a multilateralism adopted to the new, call it multipolar, call it whatever you want, world. Otherwise, what will happen is exactly what President Putin wants to do, which is to lead to the division of the world into spheres of influence with the lack of any multilateralist regulator, if it's good English. So that would be my long answer to your very good question.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question. And let's give this one last question to our young colleague on the left side. Yeah, you have the floor.
Thank you. So how are you planning to decrease the dependence on China regarding the imports of the whole world, more or less? Because are you planning to produce all the things you import right now from your own country? I don't know.
Wow, that's a tough question. A question for Jill.
Good.
So I think it depends on the product, but we are trying to decrease our dependency. And it's a question I ask of German industry quite a lot. The biggest ones here, I guess, are chemicals industry and car industry. So all of us are now in the world of trying to create our own semiconductors. All of us are in the world of trying to create our car batteries, because that's another big dependency. And it's about trying to reskill our workforces or find other parts of the world where we can help reskill their workforces. But this is why it goes back to what Amy said about decoupling is not the answer. We want to trade with China. We just don't want to be over-dependent in certain sectors with China. But we're not going to be able to fix it overnight. And in some areas, our countries cooperate on this, but in other areas, we want to beat each other, a bit like we want to beat each other on being the biggest support to Ukraine. And I would call that healthy competition. But what we have with China in many sectors at the minute is not healthy competition. It's threatening competition. Sorry, I didn't...
Couldn't hear.
Phones, was that?
Yeah.
Boats.
So
Boats?
I feel like a lot of the chips for phones are...
Oh, chips,
I could
yeah.
say so.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that you say that, because, if the Taiwan Strait is taken over and shut down, 50% of the shipping in the world is blocked. And that affects every country. Chips are one thing that we've been working on and need more and more diversification and de-risking. So having an Intel plant in Magdeburg, Germany, creating advanced microchips is a good example of that. We cannot depend on China for microchips and still feel that we're able to resist blackmail and being taken hostage. And so Apple is now looking to move out into other countries. So there are many countries that have the capacity, the workforces, to produce these advanced technologies. And these countries, allies around the world, not just European and the US, not just Western, but countries all around the world, including in Asia, if they build up the capacity and we trade among the vast number of countries that are capable of doing this, it won't be playing into Xi's playbook, which is to take over countries' industries when they get advanced and hire Chinese nationals rather than help African countries and South American countries. And all of our countries build our own advanced labor forces. And so I think it's the right question to ask, and we're working on trying to answer it in a very positive way, which will secure the future of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, as well as help us get through so we don't create a new Cold War.
And sorry, Nora, could I just add one thing to that? It's not just about imports, it's about us offering alternative investment opportunities. You know, if you're a developing country and China rocks up with huge loans to build your infrastructure, but nobody else is offering you that, you're going to take it. So one thing our countries are working together on, as is Germany, is providing alternative finance or loans on preferential term, particularly on green technology investment, so that developing countries have alternative sources of finance and don't become more dependent on China. So that's the other side of the coin as well.
It's the perfect question because it's actually the question we are trying to answer in more specific ways, so that this is a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom.
Right. You see, you obviously hit a nerve with your question. So thanks very much for this. Unfortunately, our time is up. We could go on and on. But I would say that this conversation has shown that diplomacy is a profession that never actually goes out of fashion. I think what we need at this point in history is able diplomats who build bridges, but also know when to talk and when not to talk. So thank you very much for these excellent panelists. Thank you very much to all of you for actively listening and for your very good questions. And also thank you very much to our hosts here at the Allied Museum for their great hospitality and for putting us together to discuss these important issues. So with this, over to you, Dr. Delattre.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Nora. Great moderating, thank you.
Thanks to the audience for very interesting questions. I think we had a very good discussion, and it's our aim to establish this as a platform for these kind of issues. So excuse me for this cold, but that's also a result of what is happening in Europe. So I'm sorry about this, but you shouldn't leave. Let me play a little bit of Santa Claus to bring you a souvenir as a gesture of gratitude of the museum to you. So finally somebody could help me here. Somebody.
I can help.
Thanks a lot, Jill.
Oh, thank you very much.
More here. To France. Monsieur Delattre.
French one is a bit bigger, right?
Yeah, which Jill has already been here, so she. And Amy, thanks a lot.
Jürgen, thank you so much.
Vielen Dank.
One for Nora.
Nora, thanks.
Heavy.
Oh, wow. Thank you very much.
So we made you an ambassador for our museum now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Oh, wow.
So yeah, all the best. I hope you find your way home safely in the snow and ice. Thanks for coming, and probably there will be a follow-up one. So we will see what kind of topics we could really touch here. And thanks a lot again.
Thank you, Jürgen.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, François.